Hello guys, MonkeyBot here, and today we're going to be discussing the potential Norsca rework. So Norsca is the only race now in Warhammer 3 that hasn't received a full-on rework, and I think it's time that they are due one. They are really lacking behind now in Warhammer 3, and in fact, even though they can now occupy every single settlement in the game, I do feel like they've actually fallen behind compared to Warhammer 2. In Warhammer 1 and 2, Norsca had to dedicate themselves to one of the 4 Chaos Gods. Achieving this would then bring on a Chaos invasion from Archaon, which you either had to defeat and become the Everchosen yourself, or you could ally up with him and basically become his vassal. And it was very thematic for Norsca to be able to have this decision in game. And we are really lacking this in Warhammer 3, and I feel like the vassal / champion dilemma needs to come back in some form, and I think it'll come in a form of DLC very similar to the style of Champions of Chaos. So let's get into the campaign map and start talking about Norsca's mechanics. So I want to talk about the allegiance mechanic, which is the main mechanic for Norsca, and it's where you have to dedicate yourself to one of the 4 Chaos Gods, being Khorne, Nurgle, Slaanesh and Tzeentch, and you do this by raising settlements throughout the Warhammer world and dedicating it to that specific god. And by doing so, you will get a variety of buffs to benefit your faction. And then by the time you get to the end of the tree, which will be tier 3, you will get a special character to join your army. So for example, if you go down the Crow line here, which is the Nurgle line, you will get casualty replenishment rate, income for ports. This will then be leveled up even further to get wound recovery time. And then finally, on tier 3, you will be able to get an exalted Great Unclean One. I actually think that these buffs were nerfed slightly compared to Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2, particularly in the last tier. For example, in Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2, again down the Nurgle line, if you were to get to level 3, you would unleash a devastating plague amongst the entire Warhammer world, which would be permanent and would never go away, creating a much more interesting campaign dynamic for the Northern campaign. So I do kind of wish that would make a little bit of a return in Warhammer 3. I do think the characters are good, although I don't think we should have demons in Norsca. I think Norsca should be a purely mortal faction. Norsca as a faction is about working their way up to become a Chaos champion and gain the ranks of the Warriors of Chaos. The same as the Warriors of Chaos is developing throughout the ranks to become a demon prince of some sort. So there's like a progression system in here. So Norsca should be completely mortal with a few Warriors of Chaos units, as the same way that the Warriors of Chaos is pretty much all mortals, but they are trying to work their way to demonhood, and it should have the same kind of impact in Warhammer 3. I do think that this system needs to be changed very slightly, and I actually think it needs to be very similar to the Demon Prince in the Daemons of Chaos. So in the Daemons of Chaos with Daniel, you have the Demonic Glory mechanic, which is the core mechanic for Daniel, and I think it should be implemented into the Norscan mechanic. Obviously, I don't think that you should be able to gain body parts. Ignore that completely. Just get rid of that. Norsca obviously doesn't need that. But I want you to focus on the top line here of each of the gods, and I think it would be very beneficial for Norsca to have something like this, where you can gain additional units and gain mechanics throughout your campaign the more you dedicate to a certain faction. So for example, if you were going down the Nurgle line here, for Daniel, you would start off with Nurglings. Obviously for Norsca, this wouldn't be the case. Instead, you would gain access to Nurgle Marauders and Nurgle Marauders with great weapons. This would be the same for tier 1 for all 4 of the Chaos Gods. I do think we should have an undivided tree as well that you should be able to dedicate yourself to, and I'll get to the reasons why later in the video. But I think this should progress very similar to how Daniel does, where I don't think you should have to raise the settlements, because raising settlements now in Warhammer 3 is kind of a bit counterintuitive. For example, you don't want to be raising the settlements now because you can actually occupy them. So maybe you can occupy them and dedicate them to one of the 4 Chaos Gods, very similar to how Daniel does it in his campaign. And then you obviously would gain more powerful units as the dedications get stronger, and then you would gain some mechanics. So for example here, you would gain access to switchable plagues, you would gain access to the bloodletting feature, maybe you can start seducing units if you go down Slaanesh, and the teleportation stance for Tzeentch. and I think this should be implied into Norsca as well. I do think you should be able to get some special units from this dedication tree. So it will go from Marauders up to the Marauder Champions, dedicated to each god, and then some sort of monstrous units later on down the track. So for Nurgle, you can maybe get Bile Trolls, as trolls seem very popular in the Norscan culture. So you can upgrade that to get Bile Trolls. Maybe you could also get a Plague Giant. Maybe for Khorne, you could have some sort of Khornite Skinwolf, for example. Maybe Tzeentch, you can have the Famirs, so you can have some sort of special Famir unit for Tzeentch. And then Slaanesh, I'm not entirely sure off the top of my head. Maybe they will introduce some sort of new units which you can add, or you could just give them some sort of Seekers mounted by Marauders. That's not Seekers then, is it? That's this one. That's the Hellstriders. Maybe you could just give them Hellstriders of Slaanesh as their sort of special unit at the end of the tree. And I think it would be a great system for Norsca to have something like this, gain those special dedicated units for those factions, and gain those mechanics along the path, making them feel like they're actually being aligned to those specific gods, rather than just getting some passive buffs, but still remaining in an undivided state. Now, let's go back to the Norscan side, and I want to talk about the DLC side of it. Now, as I said in the intro of this video, I do think that this will come alongside some form of DLC, very similar to the Champions of Chaos DLC, where you will get 4 legendary lords, each dedicated to one of the 4 Chaos gods. And I think instead of being called the Champions of Chaos, it will be called the Vassals of Chaos. Now, Chaos as a faction, I'm talking about all of Chaos, is all about upgrading through the ranks to the next tier. So for Norsca, it's about becoming the leader of your tribe to eventually being able to become so powerful where you become a champion of chaos, maybe even an ever-chosen or someone dedicated to one of the 4 chaos gods. And then when you're the warriors of chaos, you progress up to the point where you become a demon prince, and then yes, you gain demonhood, and that is like the ultimate victory for any sort of chaos worshipper. So I think that should be implemented in the Norscan faction here, where you are progressing up to that chaos champion for the warriors of chaos. So I think they should be starting off as vassals. So yes, I do think that the Norscan DLC should actually start off as vassals. I think it will be a very unique way to introduce a vassal system for the player. I think it's the first time in Total War history actually where the player would actually be the vassal rather than the master. In all previous Total War games, and especially in Warhammer 3, the vassal system is always you are the master controlling these factions, and now you have been swapped where you are now the vassal trying to find a way to overthrow your master. And I think it should be linked to the Champions of Chaos DLC. So let's say you have the Tzeentch Norscan Legendary Lord that will start here, and you will automatically start as a vassal to Village the Curseling, who would already have taken the Red Fortress. It is now your job to do whatever your master bids. So if Village decides to declare war on Cathey, you have to fight Cathey. Declare war on these Warriors of Chaos, you have to fight these Warriors of Chaos, or so on and so forth. Maybe even the Chaos Dwarfs. You have no diplomatic power whatsoever in this campaign. You just have to do what your master tells you to do, and that is it. So let's say that he declares war on these Cathey factions here. Your job is to attack them, and every settlement that you gain allegiance points to Tzeentch, progressing down that line, gaining Tzeentch Marauders, gaining Tzeentch specific units, maybe like the Famir units that I told you about earlier, maybe gaining access to Changing of the Ways, maybe a more powerful version of that tree than an undivided one like Wolfric or Throg would have. This would be a much more powerful dedication tree for Tzeentch, and you'll gain a lot more mechanics and a lot more units from this. Maybe even get some Chaos Warriors of Tzeentch, for example. And then eventually you would get to the end of this tree where you would have a choice. You could either dedicate yourself to Village, where Village would become an endgame crisis. He will gain loads and loads of armies, very similar to how Archaon had it in Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2, and you will become a full-on vassal. He will declare war on everyone in the surrounding area and become a powerhouse, and your job is to guide him through that so he can have his victory. Or the other way is that you can decide to overthrow him and become the champion yourself. So again, he will spawn an endgame crisis, very similar again to Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2 with Archaon, where he will still be an endgame crisis and you have to defeat Village and get rid of all of his settlements, defeat his faction, so you can become the champion of Tzeentch, where you will gain a huge amount of faction-wide bonuses. I think in Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2 it was minus 80% upkeep, for example, something really powerful like that. And maybe at that point you can gain access to a few demonic units, maybe some pink horrors and the Lord of Change that you can originally get in this tree here, but only if you defeat Village, not if you decide to stay as his vassal. And I think it'll be very interesting as a campaign actually, where you have no diplomatic power at all. That's very, very unique for a campaign in Total War, and it'll be really awesome for all of these factions, in fact. So obviously Azazel, you will gain a vassal up here, and then this will become your vassal, and then you can take out some of the Norscans around you, or going to war with Kislev, whatever Azazel decides for you to do. And then you've got Valkyria the Bloody up here, which will gain a vassal. And then maybe, I would say, for Festus the Leech Lord, now this is a confusing one because there's not actually a Norscan vassal nearby, but maybe you could just put him up here, or maybe even have a Norscan settlement here that you start off with, where you have to go to war against your master's enemies. I do think that this will be slightly different for Wulfric and Throg. They will not start off as vassals, so you will have a lot more freedom in your campaigns, and very similar to how it is now, but you will gain access to all 5 of the trees, including the undivided tree. But again, if you dedicate yourself to one of the 4 Chaos Gods, that faction will then become, so let's say as Wulfric, you dedicate yourself to Nurgle. Festus will become super powerful, and you can either become his vassal, like you would with any other campaign, or you can choose to defeat him and become the Nurgle champion yourself. So you just have a lot more freedom with Wulfric and Throg, but with the other legendary lords that will come in the Vassals DLC, you are a lot more restricted in your campaigns, and you just have to follow your master no matter what, and you will only have access to that dedicated God's tree, just at a much more powerful state. Just one more thing about the undivided tree, I think it would only be available for Throg and Wulfric. This tree would be very similar to the dedicated God's tree, except it will have a much more undivided field. So this will just buff up your Marauders, buff up your Trolls, your Mammoths, all your basic units, your Horsemen, all of those basic units, and you will get to the point where you can either become the Everchosen and overthrow Archaon, or you will become Archaon's vassal. I do think that this would be the perfect opportunity to add a Warriors of Chaos endgame crisis as a normal endgame crisis for all of the other factions. I do think that that option should be available for Norsca, as it was in Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2, but I think for the endgame crisis, I think that Archaon the Everchosen should confederate automatically all of the other legendary lords in the game, and they should just gain massive amount of armies and then start piling their way down into the old world. And I think that this should be accomplished through the undivided tree, where you will be able to become a vassal to a much more powerful master, essentially being Archaon, with all of the confederated legendary lords. So you can become a vassal to one of the chosen champions of Chaos, or you can choose to become a vassal to Archaon, where you will get all of the legendary lords under your master's power. I do think that there are some features I just want to talk on a little quickly. I do think the confederation mechanics should stay the same. So if I was to attack, I'm playing Wulfric at the moment. So if I was to attack this army here and beat it, let's just do that. I don't care how many I lose. I will then be able to confederate that army and this faction into my faction right here and gain territory. I do think that this should be an option even for the Vassals factions. So if, for example, Valkyria gain this as your vassal, and then you will go to war over here against the other Norscan factions, you should be able to confederate them as normal, but only if Valkyr decides to go to war against them. You cannot do that any other way. The only other thing that we should really touch on is the monster hunting mechanic. I think it should stay the exact same. I think it should be available for all of the legendary lords, including the vassal legendary lords. I just think it needs to be expanded a little bit more to be able to deal with the game 3 races. So maybe you can fight a specific ogre unit, maybe you can do an ice bear for Kislev, a terracotta sentinel for Cathey, and maybe the 4 greater demons for the 4 chaos gods. Just add a little few monsters here and there, and maybe even other monsters from other factions that are already in the game. Just add a little bit more into this. Maybe rogue idol from the greenskins, for example. You can add just more monsters into this, but how the monster system works, I think it should stay the exact same. I don't have a problem with it whatsoever. Now, just to touch on the technology tree, I think the technology tree is already really good for Norsca. I really do love the fact that you have to go out and capture these capitals for the races, the different races. So, for example, I have to go on and capture the Great Hall of Greases to get the one for the ogres, and Weijing for Cathey, and so on and so forth for all of the other races. I think that's really nice. I think it's really thematic. It gives you another goal to aim for, some sort of objective instead of just going around conquering the world. I think it'll be very interesting as well. So, for example, again, if you are the vassal of Village, for example, you are very close to Cathey, and you will be able to get that buff very, very quickly. Which, and again, it's very, very unique for Norsca to have these kind of buffs. These are all very unique buffs. And again, if you were going up with Valkyr the Bloody, for example, you would be very close to, where is it? There is a Dark Elf one around here somewhere. The Dark Elves, where you can get income from raiding and hero capacity for mere heroes. And it will be very, very good, I think. And again, your heroes will become immortal, meaning you can use a lot of heroes in your campaign for agent actions and so on. I think it would make it very interesting to be closer to different capitals to get these really powerful buffs early on, making the vassal system even more unique. And yes, I think the technology tree is amazing as it is. I really don't think it needs any changes whatsoever. And that's going to be it for my Norscan prediction video. Obviously, in the DLC, there's going to be a lot of units that come alongside this DLC. Maybe a couple of legendary heroes, all that jazz, you know. But I kind of stick away from those things because I think they're just kind of, they were given. We're going to get new units. It's just pulling things out of a hat, just trying to find what units would go alongside this DLC. But I think there's going to be a lot of new stuff that come along that. But let me know what you think about the changes that I've talked about so far. What do you think about the vassal system? What do you think about the rework to the allegiance system? Do you think that the monster hunting system is good the way it is? Do you want to see any changes to the technology tree? Let me know in the comment section below. If you want to check out some of my other videos, I've got an achievement hunting campaign that's going on at the moment where I'm trying to get the legendary achievement for all of the races within Total War Warhammer 3. There is a list of the races that I've completed so far with the playlists in the description down below. Continuing on with that legendary achievement series, I'm also doing a Wood Elf live stream, which I started on Wednesday. I'll be continuing that in about 2 hours time from the release of this video, so please feel free to come in and check out that. But until then, guys, thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys all in the next one. Bye for now.